Hello everyone, today I'll be showing IMF farming in BTD6. So, I'm going to be playing this week's boss event using IMF farming. So, this week's boss event is a few modifiers that make it a lot better, and it's 70% ability cooldown reduction. Now, 70% ability cooldown reduction is really good for IMF because IMF is an ability, so you could get more IMF abilities than you normally would. And this week also has 1,350 starting cash, so that means that we're able to get Ben round 1 and bank a lot earlier than you usually would have. Usually you get bank on round 19, but now we're going to get a round 16 bank because of the extra starting cash. So IMF farming starts the exact same as every single other farming. Pretty much defend with as little as possible and get a bank as early as possible. So I'm just going to be defending with a pretty standard double dart defense. Preferably use sub, but unfortunately the sub sucks on this map, so we're not going to be using that today. Now, I highly recommend that you watch my other videos first before you try IMF farming, because if you don't understand, get a basic understanding of just how to farm in general, do not try IMF farming. Please do not. Because IMF farming is probably the most complicated farming strategy in the entire game. There's a lot of factors that go into IMF farming, and every single one must be mastered if you're actually going to profit from IMF farming. Now, I would also not recommend using this in solo because after you beat the boss, well, you're going to have a mountain of debt you need to pay off, and that's going to be worse than just using normal farming if you for the tier 2 boss. So I would not recommend using IMF farming in solo, but it is really good for co-op, and in co-op you don't have to worry about debt because you could just give all the money to somebody else instead. Alright, that's enough ranting about IMF. So, Boomerang is probably the go-to defense for IMF because a 202 Boomer, that can defend for quite a while until maybe around round 35, 36. And since Boomer is such good early defense, especially on a lot of these beginner maps where most boss events are usually on, they have a lot of loops, the Boomerang can easily exploit and maximize its pierce. So it's very important to min-max the early game as much as you possibly can, because every single little bit counts for IMF, because you're just getting a little bit of extra money that could make a major difference later on, and that difference can be the small difference between getting one IMF or two IMFs, because you might be just a barely off getting, let's say, 3 IMFs from jumping from 1 to 3 IMF loans. So min-maxing the early game is very important. That's also why I highly recommend, please go watch my other videos. And if you're not willing to min-max, don't use this farming strategy. So on round 27, we are going to buy an IMF, and then once we've gotten all the farm ticks, we sell this 202 farm and deposit all of our money into that farm. So this means that we're going to get around 12,500 by round 29, at the end of round 29, with depositing. we're not going to sell the other 202 farm for now because instead I want to go for 1 into 3 IMF loans. And 1 into 3 is pretty tight. So with the deposited money, I'm able to get 12,500. I do over deposit a little bit, but that's okay. I get a double discount, sell the 202 farm, buy 2 banana farms and upgrade them to bank. And then I use my IMF ability and upgrade both of my banks to IMF loans. So if I didn't min-max the early game, I would have not been able to get 3 IMFs. I would have been stuck at 2, and being stuck at 2 means that you're having one less IMF to work with. And it's also important to note that it's not necessarily a good idea to immediately use an IMF ability. It's sometimes better to wait to use an IMF ability so I was to get a little bit of extra money to buy an extra IMF. So another important part of IMF farming is paying off the debt. So by depositing and collecting, you're able to immediately pay off the debt using the money you have on hand. And using that trick, we're going to be using that trick a lot in this run. By depositing and collecting, you can immediately get the IMF ability because you can't use the IMF ability while that IMF is in debt. So using that little trick, we're able to immediately pay off without having to wait. But doing that requires quite a lot of micro. And another important thing that makes IMF farming so hard is because you need to micro a lot. Because if your micro is super slow, then you're not going to get your IMF abilities up in time. Since this week is 70% cooldown, it doesn't matter as much, but on a standard, in normal circumstances, it's very important that you be as fast as possible because sometimes in some circumstances getting the IMF abilities is really, really tight. So on round 36, we're going to collect all. And then we're going to get a discount village. Only one discount village. While you're in debt, it's only really worth it to get a single discount village if you're going to use it for 2 banks. You only use double discount if you are going for 1 into 3 IMFs. So I use the deposit and collect trick to immediately pay off these loans and get 2 more IMFs. Then I get a wall of fire, so I could defend round 36. Wall of Fire is a pretty good tower for IMF farming. Its defense were really, really cheap. And the Wall of Fire, it's going to pop every single balloon type besides purple, but there aren't any purple balloons, so we don't have to worry about that. So another important thing to note is depositing. It's only worth it to deposit if you're not going to get an IMF for like the next 2 rounds, because depositing, it's only going to get interest on it 1 round after you deposit the money. So it's important that you don't deposit when you don't have to. Now we're going to get our last set of IMFs. We're going to get 2 more IMFs in the Radius Discount Village. So for round 38, we're going to collect our IMF abilities, then use the deposit collect trick to pay off these IMFs. We get 3 IMFs immediately, use this deposit to collect trick to buy an IMF, and then do it again, use another IMF loan ability, and then we get 8 IMFs. So we're not able to get any more IMFs before the tier 1 boss. So now I build a boat here. This is going to become a favorite trades for extra sellback on the IMFs. I then deposit into this farm because it's going to, the money's going to stay in the bank for at least 2 rounds, so it is worth depositing there. Now we get a glue gunner for some stalling. And then once we get these IMF abilities up on cooldown, we're going to use that money to buy a favorite trades. And then we're going to upgrade these IMFs to 042. So once we use the IMF ability, we upgrade them to 042 for extra sellback and then proceed to sell them. And then now, if you've done that all properly, you should easily be able to make over 100k by the tier 1 boss. And it's quite crazy the amount of money you can make with IMF farming. And in another run I did, you could see the absolute insane amount of defense you're able to afford. Gonna get an overclocked mad for the tier 1 boss with jungle drums and Alk buff with like 20k left over. Quite crazy. Anyways, thanks for watching.